After a hard-fought victory for the Marshall Islands, Admiral Raymond Spruance and the Fifth Fleet headed 1,000 miles westward to the Mariana Islands. Capturing and holding these islands meant that Tokyo would be in range of the U.S. heavy bombers, the B-29 Superfortress. On June 11th, U.S. ships began softening up the Japanese defenses with a 4-day bombardment. On the 4th day, Marines landed on the island of Saipan and established a beachhead. Aided by one of the most advanced propeller-driven fighters ever made, the F-4U Corsair, the Marines took the island fairly quickly. Once the news reached Tokyo, Japanese High Command put together a carrier group to take back the Mariana Islands. It consisted of 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 5 battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 31 destroyers, 24 submarines, as well as 450 carrier aircraft and 300 land-based aircraft. Luckily, a U.S. submarine spotted the carrier group and reported the news immediately. Losing the Marianas was not an option, so the U.S. sent their main carrier force to meet them in the largest aircraft carrier battle to ever take place. The American force consisted of 7 fleet carriers, 8 light and 8 heavy cruisers, 7 battleships, 69 destroyers, 28 submarines, and approximately 900 carrier-based aircraft. Also, 8 light carriers. The main aircraft used by the Japanese in this battle were the A6M0 fighter, the Aichi D3A dive bomber, and the Nakajima B5N torpedo bomber. Early in the morning, June 19th, the Japanese aircraft carriers began to launch air raids on the U.S. carrier groups. Fortunately, the U.S. caught sight of the impending attack on their radar and dispatched 450 fighter planes consisting of F-6F Hellcats, F-4F Wildcats, and the speedy F-4U Corsair. At this time, Japanese air power was substantially weaker than what it had been, due to the campaign in the Marshall Islands, as well as combat all across the Pacific. While their planes were very well equipped for what they needed to do, most of the pilots were new recruits and had very little to no real air combat experience. This put them at an extreme disadvantage due to the fact that they were going up against battle-hardened and combat-ready American aces. For instance, this particular morning, one American ace by the name of Alexander Vreeshuh managed the feat of shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in only an 8-minute time frame, with 360 rounds of ammunition. The Japanese Zero fighter was a fast, light, and nimble plane, being able to outmaneuver most Allied aircraft. But this agility came at the price of firepower and other armaments. For a time, the United States' fighters were heavier and slower, but had much more firepower as well as more armored protection. But eventually, Allied planes caught up with the Japanese agility, while also maintaining all the firepower and armor. This was due to the Americans' massive industrial power that was capable of producing an immense amount of aircraft, as compared to Japan's largely bombed out factories and continuously running short on resources. During this battle that lasted no more than a day, these brand new, ill-trained Japanese airmen went up against the overwhelming force of the U.S. naval aviators. It was a heavily one-sided battle. Japanese aircraft fell out of the sky in a fiery rain. One after another, the Allied aviators racked up kills left and right, without hardly any losses at all. In just the first few minutes of the battle, a U.S. submarine fired a torpedo at the newest and largest Japanese carrier, named the Taiho, while aircraft were still trying to take off of it. At the exact same time, in another location, a U.S. sub hit another fleet carrier, named the Shokagu, and it was completely demolished and sunk within just a few minutes. Late in the afternoon, the U.S. fleet finally pinpointed another carrier, the Hayo. Admiral Mark Mitcher, knowing it was somewhat late in the day for an attack, decided to take a gamble and authorized the strike. The Hayo was hit and sunk. During the long trip back, it slowly became too dark for the planes to find their own carriers, and they were running dangerously low on fuel. Many pilots had to ditch into the sea because they simply could not make it back. Mitcher, not wanting to lose all of his men at sea, decided to take another gamble and turn on the carrier lights for all of the planes to find their way home. Luckily, there were no enemy submarines to spot them. Many of the aircraft lost were only lost in these few hours of nightfall, with around 80 either ditching or crashing upon landing. In the first 4 hours of the battle, the Japanese losses numbered up to approximately 300, while the U.S. casualties were only around 90. By the end of the battle, the Japanese not only lost about 600 aircraft, but had ship casualties as well, with 2 fleet carriers, a light carrier, and 2 oil tankers sunk. After it was all over, a U.S. soldier commented on the battle, nicknaming it forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The American forces got off almost scot-free, with a loss of only 123 aircraft, a damaged battleship, and a total of 109 overall casualties. There weren't even enough planes left on Japan's side to fill the decks of the remaining carriers. The loss of this battle meant a major victory for the U.S. and would be a huge step closer to winning the war. From this point on, America had air superiority over the entire Pacific theater, giving them all the opportunity to attack when and whenever they want. The Japanese would never recover from this loss, losing their remaining fleet of carriers in the Battle of Midway. The U.S. would go on to finish taking the Marianas and establish air raids on the Japanese homeland. The war finally came to an end when a Bu-29 superfortress named Enola Gay dropped the only 2 atomic bombs to ever be used in combat on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye!